Hi everyone and welcome to the sew-along video. So this garment is a woven fabric, so you can't use knits for this design. So we're going to be mainly using our sewing machine. So thread up your sewing machine and bobbin with thread that matches your fabric, and then set up your overlocker with 3 threads of colour that match your fabric as well. So generally, because we're only tidying the edges, we only need 3 threads in our overlocker, but I'm going to use 4 because I just like the look of 4, but really you only need to use 3. So this video is going to jump around a little bit. Generally, when we are sewing a garment, we put all the smaller pieces together first, and then we sew in a standard order. Because there's so many options for this garment, you're going to need to jump around and find the video that suits the version you're sewing. If you have the plain back, you can skip over the assembling the back pieces section. If you have the plain front, you can skip over the assembling the front pieces section. There's 2 types of sleeves we're going to sew in, so you can just jump across to whichever sleeve that you're preparing. So because there's so many options for this garment, I'm not going to be doing a written construction sequence, but generally what we're going to be doing is putting all the front pieces together, putting all the back pieces together, assembling the sleeve of your choice, then we sew the front to the back at the shoulders, we assemble the sleeves, and then we sew the hems in. So when you're ready, I'm going to start this video off with assembling the back. So this is the back with a lower back frill. Here is my back frill piece, and as you can tell, it curves. Now when you look at it, in the very center you'll have a double notch. So that double notch is going to show us the center back position. Now this piece is gathered, so we have to run a line of gathering stitches along the edge. So what I'm going to do is on this edge here, which is where it's going to attach to the lower back, so this is the inside curve edge here, we're going to run a line of tacking stitches. So the first thing I'm going to do is lengthen my stitch length slightly, and I'm going to sew a line of stitches at the 1 centimeter 3/8 of an inch line, because that's the seam allowance in this pattern for a woven garment. Now you can of course use a gathering foot if you have it. So this is right side up, and the fabric I'm sewing today is a silk cotton, so it's quite light and floaty. So from this right side, I'm going to take one of the threads and gently pull it. Now it doesn't matter if you pull the thread from the right side or pull the thread at the wrong side. What you need to make sure you do is, whichever thread you choose on the right, you use the same thread for the left. If you don't, it will not, and you'll have to take it all out and start again. So just gently pull those gathers together and come to the other side, find the same thread, and if they're both on top, just use a pin or something to pull one through to the bottom. It's easier if you have one thread on top and one thread at the bottom. So at this point you don't have to be perfect, you just have to vaguely gather it in to help you out when we're going to be pinning it together. So come back and find those double notches, and I'll put a pin here so you can see them. So here is our back frill, it's really a half peplum, right side up. Then take your back piece and place it right side down. So we've got right sides together, and find that double notch position and match it. Then come to this side and match the edges here. And come to the other side and match the edges here. Now, as you can see, I need to gather that material, that fabric, in just a little bit more. So what I do is come back to my line of thread and just gather it in a little bit more. We don't have to be perfect at this stage. And then come to the other side and do the same. Right, now it's easier if you sew this with the frill on top, so turn this over. Come to this edge here and we're going to sew this together. So take your first pin out, find the raw edge and match it, and stitch some back tack stitches, just 2 or 3 stitches, remembering to drop your stitch length back to normal for your machine. So for me and my machine, it's set at 2.5. I'm just going to run a couple of back tack stitches. Oh. So I'm just going to run a couple of back tack stitches just to anchor the beginning of my work in place. Now when we stitch this gathering into place, we want to stitch it just to the very side of our gathering thread. So that will make sure our gathering stitches are hidden, and it also means we don't have to remove that line of gathering, which is a lot easier. So now you've anchored your work into place, what we're going to do is just move this frill up, this gathering, until it's more or less even across the piece. We want to make sure the frill has a nice even gather across the half back, and just take your time at adjusting that. Now when we sew this into place, we want to make sure that we don't have any puckers, so we need to be very careful that we're stitching on or just to the left of that line of gathering stitches. And there's no easy way around this, you just have to take your time and do it very slowly. Sometimes I find it easier to just have a pin and just pull some of the gathers up underneath my foot. So when you're ready, start sewing this and maintain that 1 centimeter, which is 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure when you reach this double notch position that your double notches match. And another good thing to do is just to take out that pin before you get to it, because you don't want a bare space where that joining position is. So once you've reached the midway point, it's always a good idea to stop with your needle down in your work and then reposition your work before you carry on. So if you need to, find that original line of gathering thread and just adjust your gathers nice and evenly. And then continue sewing to the other side. One last thing with the gathers, when you get towards the side seam, it's a good idea if you don't have any gathers within the last 1 to 1.5 centimeters, which is around about 1/2 inch. It just helps you a little bit easier when you're sewing other seams in. So when you get to the end, remember to back tack. And then have a look at your peplum gathering and just check that you can't see your line of gathering stitches there. If you can, you'll need to remove them. So if you're comfortable that's all correct, we're going to go to the overlocker and overlock the raw edge to tidy it up. So our overlocker comes in handy because it has that blade that can tidy up our edge here, but what we want to do is just use the overlocker to cut off these fraying threads, and you can also use it to cut off and hide the threads of the gathering at the beginning and end. So the main thing when you're overlocking this edge is to make sure it doesn't gather up underneath. It's a good idea to keep this on a really flat surface and take your time. And as you can tell, that overlocker really tidies up all the edges of our gathering there. So while we're here, what we're going to do now is overlock the hem. The hem isn't completed to the very end when we sew the hem as a whole with the front, but we can certainly start the overlocking process off now while we're at the overlocker. So just right side up, overlock the raw edge of the hem. Right, so if you have option 2 back, we're now going to sew a 1 centimeter hem. So come to the hemline, turn the hem so wrong sides are together, turn that up by 1 centimeter, which is 3/8 of an inch. If you find it easier, you could press this with your iron first. And just go ahead and stitch that, and make sure your stitches are sitting right in that overlocking line. Right, so take that to your iron and give that a really good press before we move on to sewing the side seams together. So I'm sewing view 2 front now. So my lower front is in a winter weight polyester. It's got a very slight stretch, so it's effectively a stretch woven, and the contrast piece I'm sewing in an embroidered net. So there is a slight stretch here. I'm just going to have to be very careful when I sew it. So what we do is place our upper front to our lower front, right sides together, and around about halfway along you'll see a small notch. So we have to make sure that the notch there matches the notch on the contrast piece, which is there. So when you're ready, starting at one side, just match it, and we're going to sew a seam at 1 centimeter, which is 3/8 of an inch. there's my center notch position there, and then just continue through to the other side. Okay, so now go to your overlocker and overlock that edge to tidy it up. So we have 4 tie pieces. You're going to need 2 for each sleeve. They're rectangles, and what we need to do now is finish a seam off on 3 sides, because the 4th side, the short side, will be sewn into the garment. So to do this, I'm just going to fold at 5 mils, so that's just shy of 1/4 of an inch, and fold again and create just a 5 mil double turn for this. What I want to do is just create a very narrow hem. So when you have 4 ties sewn, take one of the upper sleeve pieces, and the position we sew the ties is at this notch here, and we sew this in before we sew in the lower sleeve. So regardless of the version you're doing, the ties will be sewn to this position here. So what we do is take 2 of your ties, match the short edges here, and we want them both facing right side up at this stage. So when it's sewn, we want them to sit like this. So this sleeve is right side up and these ties are right side up. So what we do is we put the ties on top of each other, turn them over so that we have right sides together on our sleeve, and just center them at that notch position. Now this is the position I have chosen to put them in. If you wanted to, you could also sew them into the underarm here so that the tie would wrap around and tie in a bow here. It's entirely up to you, but for now I'm sewing these into the center of the top arm line of the sleeve. So just find that notch, position those in place, and just tack stitch them in. It doesn't need to be sewn in at 1 centimetre, you just need to tack stitch them within that 1 centimetre seam allowance. So they're going to sit like that. And so that's the upper sleeve area and the ties done. And then what we do now is we can sew the lower sleeve to it. So we're going to start the frilled sleeve assembly, and we have the undersleeve and then the undersleeve frill, and these are the 2 pieces we're going to start with. So we've got a pair of each of these, so that means a mirror piece of each of these. So what I'm going to do is just, at the moment they're right sides together, I'm just going to take 1 set of them and just put them aside. So the undersleeve here, let me just pop that out of the way. The undersleeve here has a shorter and a longer side to it. The shorter side we're going to sew to the sleeve part, so we just don't worry about that one for now. The longer side is the side we're going to be sewing. So this is right side up, the longer side, and we want to sew the longer side of this undersleeve to the shorter side of the undersleeve frill. And here you can see there's a shorter side and a longer side, and we can just turn that round like that. so that we have right sides together. So those pieces are going to sew in like that. We're going to do exactly what we just did if you did the back peplum. We're going to run a line of gathering stitches, and then we're going to make that fit that shorter edge. So put the undersleeve away for a moment, and we're going to work on the undersleeve frill. So right side up, we're going to sew a line of gathering stitches on the shorter edge. We're going to stitch these with a longer stitch length at 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch. Sorry, I was just distracted for a moment there. So when you're ready, just run a line of gathering stitches with a longer stitch length. When you come to the centre, you'll see a notch, and we need to make sure that notch will sew to the other piece in a moment. And that will just help keep our gathers nice and even. Find that notch and just pop a pin in it so you don't lose track of it. Then take one of these gathering threads and gently gather. Then come to the other side, and if you used the gathering thread on the top, use the same gathering thread on the other side and gently gather that in. Now take your undersleeve, and we're going to sew this to the longer side of the undersleeve. So making sure you have the long side and that we have right sides together. Place that to the frill and then turn it over. Take a pin and on the upper edge match the raw edges. Where your pin is in the centre, you can either reposition that pin, which is your notch, on the notch underneath and repin it, or you could put a second one in if you prefer, and then come to the end and pin that position as well. Now what we need to do is just distribute that gather through the area. So you may need to reduce the gather by pulling it out, or you may need to tighten up the gather by making it shorter. Once you have an approximate area, take out your first pin and at 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch, just do a small back tack to secure that in place. And now take your time and distribute those gathers towards the first notch, which is the centre of that sleeve. And then stitch to secure just to the left of your original stitching. We really want to sort of just stitch on top of it. The main thing we're looking for is we do not want to create any little tucks in there. We want it to just be a nice frill, smooth, with no pleats. Take your time and come towards the centre notch. And then repeat what you've done on the other side. Now go ahead and repeat what you've done on the other piece. So when you have those two sleeves finished, what you need to do now is overlock them. So come to this join area here and overlock. And then because we're at the overlocker, turn this over and overlock the gathered edge hem into position. Well, it's really just the overlock so we can hem it later. And remember to repeat that on the other piece. So take this piece and fold it in half, and we're going to sew the seam here. So we're going to sew the seam at 1 centimetre. So when you're ready, match the edges at the top. 1 centimetre is 3/8 of an inch. Remember to back tack. And as you sew down, make sure oops, seems to be pulling up somewhat. Make sure that this seam here is sitting on top of each other. And make sure that the hem edge matches. Now some people will tell you should have sewn this into a tube and then sewn that into a tube together first. You certainly can do it this way. The fact is it's underneath and it's hidden. That's why I've done it this way, because it's a little bit quicker. So when you've done that on one of those pieces, repeat for the other piece and then overlock the edge to tidy it. So that's what we're looking for, and when you've done that, go ahead and repeat that for the other piece, the other sleeve. So now's a really good time to sew the hemline in here. What we're going to do is sew this at 1 centimetre. So if you need to, turn this up 1 centimetre and press. If you don't need to, that's fine too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this so that the right side is out. And then I'm going to come to the seam here. I'm going to turn up 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch, and I'm just going to tuck that line of overlocking thread in. Make sure you trim it back to about 1 inch, 2.5, 3 centimetres first. So turn that up, and as I said, if you need to, you can press that, and start by back tacking a couple of stitches, and then sew your hem at 1 centimetre all the way around. So that's 3/8 of an inch, and sew it so that your stitching sits exactly on top of the overlocking, because that will hide it. So with all sewing, it's a really good idea to sew a seam and then press a seam. So go ahead and sew the other hem in place, and then go to your iron and press that. Now we're working on the upper sleeve frill, so you'll have a pair of those. So take one of them and right sides together, fold it like this, and we're going to sew a seam here. And go ahead and repeat that for the other piece. Now we're going to go to our overlocker and overlock that. Now while you're here, it's a really good idea to overlock this area here, which is going to be our hem. So if you look at the piece, it's the longer side of it. So we just want to overlock it with one layer, and we're going to do that from the right side, and I suggest you start around the seam line we've just overlocked. And then go ahead and repeat that for the other piece. So we don't want the short edge, we want the longer edge from the right side. Now we're going to sew the hem in on that edge we've just overlocked. So it's a good idea to turn it through so that it's right side out, and then start overlocking from the edge we overlocked. Start sewing from the edge we overlocked earlier. So just turn that up, tuck your overlocking end in. If you need to trim it back, just trim it back. Half an inch or an inch is really good, so a couple of centimeters. Turn it up by 1 centimeter, which is 3/8 of an inch. Start and finish that hem off by back tacking. Repeat for the other piece. And then take these to your iron and press those into place. So this upper sleeve that we've just put the hem onto is going to sit like this. But to make it fit correctly, we have to gather this upper edge. So what we're going to do is take this upper piece, and we're going to run a line of gathering stitches 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch from this upper edge. Now if you're like me and I haven't quite matched that properly, what I'm going to do is just tidy it up now so that I've got a nice smooth line when I go to sew it. So make sure that stitch length is lengthened, and start and finish your gathering on either side of that seam line. So directly opposite that seam you'll find a notch. Go ahead and mark it now with a pin so you can see it a bit clearly. And then find one of those gathering threads and gently pull in your gather. and then do the same on the other side. Once you're at this stage, take one of these pieces of sleeve like this and pop it inside this piece here. What we want is the seams to sit on top of each other. So when you find that seam position, pop them together and place a pin there. And then come to the pin you found or you placed in that first piece that you ran the gathers with, and find the corresponding notch on the other piece, which will be directly opposite here, and pin those together. So that will help you with your position of your gathers. So now we want to tack stitch the gather of this piece onto the under piece. Now we're only going to tack stitch it at this stage because we have to sew the upper sleeve piece on next. This you need to be a little bit careful with. The easiest way to do this is to turn it inside out. Start sewing from the seam position. So the easiest way to do this is to find that seam position, just put a couple of tacking stitches in there, a back tack stitches in to hold it in place, and then find that notch position there and gently distribute those gathers between those positions. So this is a little bit more fiddly at this stage here, and you do need to take your time to make sure those gathers are nice and even. And when you're ready, just sew your line on top of or just to the left of that gathering line. When you're finished, just turn that inside out and have a turn it right way out and just have a look at it and just check that it all looks fine. Alright, so you're going to go ahead and repeat that for the other sleeve. So pop those pieces away somewhere safe, and we're now going to start working on the sleeve area, the upper arm sleeve area. Take one of your sleeve pieces, place it right sides together, and we're going to sew the underarm seam here at 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch. And then repeat that for the other piece, right sides together. And now go to your overlocker and tidy that edge up on this piece and the other one. So when you're ready, put one of those pieces aside and take one of the lower sleeve pieces we worked on earlier. So at the moment this piece is right side out. So what I'd like you to do is take one of the sleeves, and we want to place this like this, so that the seam here matches the seam on this piece here. And when you have that in the correct position, pin that in place. Now as you come around the top, you'll see a small notch here. Now that notch will match with the notch on the underpiece here, so pin that into place as well. Now if you've sewn this correctly, what you will find is this will have 3 layers, and that's the seam we need to sew now. So it's a good idea, what I like to do is just hold it like that and then place another pin about halfway down. I turn it round and do it on the other side, and the whole time I'm just double checking that all of that gathering, the raw edges, is facing upwards, is all together. Basically we want to make sure that nothing is facing the wrong way. So when you're ready, we're going to sew that seam into place. So we want to sew that seam into place exactly on the original line of stitching, so that will make sure we don't crush or pleat any of our gathers. So start at the underarm seam edge, making sure you take your pins out as you go and that the top edge is even, and sew exactly on that line of previous stitching. Remember when you back tack, when you get back to the beginning position. Now go ahead and overlock that and then repeat that for the other sleeve. So now I'm going to sew in the bell sleeve, which is view 2 or option 2 of the sleeves. So with this piece we have a short edge and a longer edge, and in the shorter edge you'll see a notch. So that notch there we need to place so it matches the notch here. So what I've done is right sides together, I've placed my lower sleeve to my upper sleeve, and I've just sandwiched those ties in the middle, and we're going to sew this seam across at 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch. Now go to your overlocker and finish that edge off. Now repeat what you've just done with the other sleeve. So while we're at the overlocker, it's a really good idea to overlock the hem of the bell sleeve now. So just run a line of overlocking with this piece right side up, right on the edge. And then repeat that for the other sleeve piece. To finish off the bell sleeve, place it right sides together because we're going to sew the underarm seam. So right sides together, match that underarm seam and sew to the hemline 1 centimetre. Make sure when you sew this that these ties are out of the way. You don't want to catch them in that seam. Now go to the overlocker and tidy up that edge. To finish the sleeve off, what we need to do now is sew the hem in. So the hem allowed for here on the sleeve is 1 centimetre. Trim any fraying with your overlocking back to 1 centimetre, 1 or 2 centimetres, around about ½ inch. And then making sure that that seam faces towards the back, tuck that overlocking in, turn that seam up. Oh, I've got some fluff there. Turn that seam up by 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. If you need to, you could press that with your iron. Start sewing at that underarm hem position, and remember to back tack at the beginning and end of your seam, and sew directly on top of your overlocking line. You may find it easier to turn the sleeve right way out. Okay, so take that to your iron, give it a really good press, and don't forget to repeat that for the other sleeve. So now we're going to sew the neckline. There's many different ways you could finish this neckline off, but I thought this would be nice with an internal bind. So what we do is place our front and back right sides together, and here is my front on top, and we're going to sew the shoulder together on this side at 1 centimetre. And then I'm going to go to my overlocker and just overlock that to tidy it off. So I believe an internal binding is possibly the easiest way of finishing a garment neckline that there is, bar setting up a binder attachment on your machine. So a lot of you won't have this, and this way of creating a finish on the neckline creates a really tidy professional finish. It really only works for lighter fabrics. They don't have to be really light, but if you're starting to get into mid-weight wools, certainly it gets a bit bulky. So what do we do? Well, take the neckline edge. So here's our garment right side up, and here's the seam we just sewed and overlocked. The first thing I'd like you to do is make sure that that seam we just sewed faces towards the back neck, and I'll just pop a pin in there just to help me out. So this is the back here. Here is our binding piece. What I'd like you to do is place it so that, fold it so that wrong sides are together. So that's what we're looking for, right sides are out. Now this piece is longer than we need because we trim it to size. Now this is cut on the bias, so it enables it to be really stretchy. So what we're going to do is come to the other neckline that we didn't sew and make sure that overlaps. We want to have excess, and just match all 3 edges there. And I'm just going to sew a couple of stitches back tack to secure that into place. Now this is a 6mm, which is a 1/4 inch seam allowed for. I've made the neckline big enough that you can put this on and off over your head without needing a zip or a button or an opening of any sort. So what we're going to do is fully enclose this neckline. So once you've secured that into place, what we're going to do is fold that exactly in half, match the raw edges, and we're going to very carefully sew without stretching a 6mm, which is 1/4 inch, or if you're using a commercial machine, foot width. Foot width varies on commercial machines between 5 and 6 millimeters. The reality is it doesn't make too much difference. Don't stretch this. And as you can tell, this method really depends on really accurate cutting out. So if you have a long metal ruler and a roller cutter with a self-healing green mat, that makes cutting these internal facings really easy, internal bindings. Okay, so we're approaching the shoulder area here. You can take that pin out now, just make sure that seam sits towards the back. So make sure when you approach the other shoulder that you back tack. And as you can tell, we've got excess binding here, but that's fine, we'll just chop that off later when we need to. Okay, so the reason we sewed at 6mm is because we're now going to roll this to the inside to create our internal binding or internal facing. People have different names for it. What we need to do to help us create the roll is pin stitch. So we need the bulk of the seam facing towards the fold. So we want all of it facing up like that. And we want to sew a line of stitches just in from the edge of the seam here. It's just going to help us with the roll. Now, I always find it easier if you start at the edge of the binding, so off the fabric, off your garment, but whatever you want to do is fine. The last step now is to roll this to the inside, and then we sew a line of stitches right on the outside edge of that piece, so on that fold edge there. So you can sew that from the right side if you prefer to control it a bit easier. I'm going to sew mine from the wrong side. Either way doesn't matter. And when we sew it, we want to sew just in from the edge of the fold. So go ahead now and press that into place, and when you've finished, we'll sew the last shoulder together. So to finish this shoulder area off, what we do is we come and place these pieces right sides together, and make sure you match the very inside neckline properly, and then we're going to sew that seam at 1 centimetre. Now you are going to have excess binding to trim off. It's always easier to trim it off at the very end. So sew that shoulder into place. take your scissors and I'm just using thread snips, which is a bit naughty, but make sure you continue the line, or you could just use your overlocker blade and then overlock that seam to finish it. So here is our overlocked seam. What we want to do now is take the top of the overlocking, trim it back to around about 1/2 inch, 1.5 centimeters. Tuck that overlocking in and push that seam towards the back. Then come to your machine and we're just going to stitch on that binding line, that 5mm, 1/4 inch binding line, just a couple of back tacking stitches just to hold that towards the back. And that's our shoulders completed. Once you've pressed this hem into place, we can sew the side seam. So right sides together, place the front to the back at the side seam. Now looking down the side seam run, you will see a notch. That notch there lines up with the seam we created to sew the peplum ruffle on. So match that and pin it into place. As you look down towards the hemline, you'll see that the frill is shorter than the back. That's fine, that's what we want. The folded edge of the hem needs to sit at the first notch there, because what we're going to do is fold this up and over and then fold again at the second notch position, like that. What this effectively means is we've got a 1 centimeter hem allowance here, 3/8 of an inch turn up, then we have 1 inch from that notch to there, which is 2.5 centimeters, and then the peplum hem is at the back. So what we've effectively got is a nice chunky hem at the front, just to add a little bit of extra detail to our garment. So for now, just pin the bottom of the hem to that notch there, and then come up to the underarm position, and let's start sewing from the underarm down. So right sides together, match the underarm point, and we're going to stitch at 1 centimeter, which is 3/8 of an inch. Take out that pin as you reach the notch position. Stop and reposition your work. And sew to around about here. Take this pin out, fold this up. So at that notch position, we want to make sure the bottom of this frill is right on the fold. We want to fold that up. So really double check that that's butted in place. Now fold the top of it down 3/8 of an inch, which is 1 centimeter, and this is what we want to be continuing to sew, and stitch through to that fold position, and remember to back tack. What this does is when we open it up, we've created a nice seamless transition for our front hem, and our front hem will be stitched up here at the 1 inch mark. So when you've done that on this side, repeat it on the other side of the garment. Now let's go to our overlocker and overlock that into place. So all we need to do now is just tidy that edge up with our overlocker. And repeat on the other side. Now you may find it easier to go and press a 1 centimetre hem up here on the front of your garment before you continue. So what we're going to do now is turn this through, and we want the hem to look like this. And just do that on both sides. Now if you want to, go ahead and press that hem into position so you can get it nice and straight. And we want to sew this hem at 2.5 centimeters. I'm going to sew this from the wrong side of my garment, and what we want to do is start right on that side seam and just sew just inside. So we want to sew just inside this fold position here. Remember to back tack at the beginning and end of your work. So this is our front hem finished. Go ahead and press that just to get a nice crisp finish. So for this view, we have a straight line all the way around, so there's a couple of options with the hem. If you had a lighter fabric, you could turn it up, turn it a second time and flat stitch it down. If it's a heavier fabric like this, what I'm going to do is overlock around the edge and then turn it up and stitch it at 1 centimeter. Now there's also a curve in the back hem, so having a smaller seam allowance might suit this style better, but it's entirely up to you. It's a very straightforward hem to sew. Regardless of which version you're sewing, setting in the sleeves is the same for both of these garments. So when we set in a sleeve, if you have a look at your sleeve piece, you will find that there are 2 notches on one side of the sleeves, and then there is a single notch at the top of the sleeve, and it's offset from center. So the double notch means that's the back, and the notch up here is going to sew to our shoulder seam. So take one of your sleeves, take your garment and turn the garment inside out. So your sleeve should be right side out, and place that sleeve into the garment and set it up so that there is right sides together. We want to match the sleeve seam here to the body seam of the garment, and then go ahead and find the notch at the top and match that to the shoulder seam at the top. Now come to the back of the garment and find the double notch on the sleeve and you'll have a double notch marked on your garment back as well, and match that into position. When we're sewing in sleeves, there's going to be more volume in the sleeve than the area we're sewing it into, the body of the garment. So that's called ease, and that's what we need to make sure is distributed properly. Generally, when you're drafting a garment, when you're pattern making, there's no ease from the underarm seam up towards what's called the front and the back pitch point for a few inches. So the ease is always from around about 2 or 3 inches up towards the sleeve head, so the sleeve cap area, so the top arm line. So long way of talking about this. What that means is when we start to sew the sleeve, it's always a good idea to start a couple of inches, maybe 6 or 7 centimeters, one side of the underarm seam, and it's always easier to sew this with the sleeve on top. So position this under your presser foot to one side of that underarm seam, and we're going to start sewing this 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch. So match those raw edges down to that underarm position. Make sure those seams are sitting on top of each other. And continue around through to that double notch position. So stop at that double notch position and find the shoulder. So here you can see this is the amount of fabric we have to ease in between the double notch and the sleeve head. So all we do is we just take our time and we use our presser foot to relieve some of that pressure as we go. Just sew a couple of stitches and release the pressure. And as you can see now, we've got back to the crown notch area. That notch is sitting directly on top of the seam. Now reposition your work and do exactly the same back to your starting point. Now if you struggle with putting that sleeve in, it's generally because your cutting is bad. You must have really accurate cutting when you go and cut sleeves. Okay, so just double check that you haven't got any tucks in your seam. You'll need to go ahead and press that, and then just repeat that for the other sleeve.